Ragnar Lothbrook, otherwise known as Ragnar Lothbrook, was said to be a legendary Viking warlord of Danish and Swedish descent. Ragnar, amongst other legendary Vikings, elude contemporary accounts and continue to slip farther into the past, in and amongst the realm of the forgotten that is now cloaked with myth. What's interesting about Ragnar is that, contrary to popular belief, there is no actual record proving his existence at all, which means I get to make stuff up. Just kidding. While he is a popular figure when considering Vikings, perhaps more so in recent times because of the popular TV show Vikings, it's important to remember that most modern academics consider the life of Ragnar Lothbrook and his supposed exploits to be shrouded in doubt and uncertainty. Many traditional pieces of literature also suggest that Ragnar set himself apart from other Vikings given his raids on Eastern Europe, France and Britain in the 9th century. These stories also have it that Ragnar's kingdom also included Scandinavian areas of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. According to Icelandic sagas, known simply as the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrook, as well as the Tale of Ragnar's Sons, Ragnar was the son of a Scandinavian king named Sigurd Ring, who was said to have ruled between Sweden and Denmark in the 8th century. It's understood that Sigurd Ring married the Norwegian princess Alfhild, and that she would give birth to Ragnar Lothbrook. When Sigurd Ring died, it would be the semi-legendary Viking known as Eystein Belli who would take over. During this time, we see one of the first exploits of Ragnar Lothbrook, who appears to grow up to be a strong and handsome young man, a warrior who was revered amongst his peers. The saga shows Ragnar coming to the aid of a Jarl, who appears to be plagued by a serpent that has grown so large it now terrorizes the town. It's understood that Ragnar devised a plan to slay the serpent, and that he donned an outfit of shaggy trousers and a cloak so as to protect himself from the serpent's bite. He then speared the serpent to death, and was hailed a hero by the Jarl, who notes his unlikely shaggy outfit and declares him Hairy Breeches, or Lothbrook. As a reward for his efforts, he receives the Jarl's daughter Thora as a wife, and the couple produce 2 sons, Eric and Agnar. But the happy family would only last so long before Thora succumbed to an illness and died. Heartbroken by the loss, Ragnar went raiding with his army and sailed to Norway, only to stumble upon a farm where a poor family lived. It's understood that amongst them is a woman named Aslaug, a daughter of a legendary dragon-slaying king of Sweden named Sigurd, and a Valkyrie of Germanic myth known as Brynhild. However, we also learn that Aslaug has been adopted by this poor family that she is found with, and that they have renamed her Kraka, or Crow, so as to keep her parentage hidden. Ragnar falls in love with her and desires to marry her, but proceeds to set her a riddle to see if she is worthy. The riddle indicates for her to come to him neither clothed nor unclothed, neither full nor hungry, and alone but with company. It's understood that Aslaug appears to Ragnar having eaten only an onion, wrapped in a fishing net, and with a dog by her side. With this, she is deemed to have solved Ragnar's riddle, and the two are married. It is with Aslaug that Ragnar has several sons, including Ivar the Boneless, a boy who is born with weak bones as a result of a curse by Aslaug because of Ragnar's impatience for sex, Bjorn Ironside, Visturk, and Ragnarvold. But the family was said to be broken up by Ragnar's ambitions. Having believed Aslaug to be nothing but a peasant girl, he becomes convinced to marry the Swedish king's daughter. However, Aslaug reveals to Ragnar of her lineage, and to prove it, prophesies that their next son will be born with snakes in his eyes. It is with this that their next son Sigurd would be born with a mark in his eye that depicted a snake biting its own tail, otherwise known in ancient Egyptian and Greek iconography as Ouroboros. And so this child would be appropriately named Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and he would be something of a saviour for their marriage. But the Swedish king who had expected Ragnar to marry his daughter was not pleased that Ragnar had gone back on his word. This would lead to a series of battles that saw Ragnar's sons from his previous marriage with Thora, Eric and Agnar, fighting against the Swedes, only to become stumped by a magical cow that protected the Swedish army. It is Aslaug who takes her sons into battle and is able to overthrow the magic and see to a successful victory. But upon seeing how well his sons did in battle, Ragnar becomes threatened by their skill. He swears an oath that he will not be outdone and that he will invade England with just 2 ships, a plan he actually sets forth in motion. However, during this ill-thought-out venture, he is captured by King Aila of Northumbria and thrown into a snake pit where he meets his demise. A 12th century poem, meaning Words of the Crow, or better known in English as The Death Song of Ragnar Lothbrook, focuses on the death of Ragnar. It is a monologue of a sort, as he lays dying in a snake pit. The poem itself, composed in 29 stanzas, details the life of the warrior, and the hope that a warrior like Ragnar might have, having finally met their death, where he will soon be at a banquet with Odin in the halls of Valhalla. The poem sees Ragnar reminisce on his battles, and he ponders on the many exploits of his own colourful career. He also notes the likelihood of his sons avenging him, and that as he dies, he will have the last laugh in the end. The poem actually ends with him saying, "Laughing, I shall die." In accordance with the poem, Ragnar is later avenged by his sons, who rally up a large Viking force, known as the Great Heathen Army, and descend upon England. After defeating the English forces, King Aila was said to have been captured by the sons of Ragnar, where he was put to death via the notorious Viking execution ritual known as the Blood Eagle. According to Danish texts, however, most notably the Gesta Danorum in the 13th century by Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, Ragnar is a ruler of Denmark, having been elevated to kingship after the death of his father. His first deed as king is to defeat the Swedish King Fro, a man responsible for the death of Ragnar's grandfather, who was the king of Norway, named Sigurd. Fro had not only killed the king, but he'd taken the women of the household and thrown them into brothels. When Ragnar arrived to face Fro, he was severely outnumbered, and the battle seemed lost, until the women of the brothels ventured out onto the battlefield and picked up the armours and weapons of the fallen men. Amongst them was a woman known as Lagertha, who was described as a skilled Amazon, who, though a maiden, had the courage of a man and fought in front amongst the bravest, with her hair loose over her shoulders. All marvelled at her matchless deeds, for her locks flying down her back betrayed that she was a woman. Lagertha led the women and rallied alongside Ragnar Lothbrook, and together they were able to crush the forces of Fro. So impressed with her courage and strength, Ragnar would ask for her hand in marriage, though she would decline. She would even go as far as to set a bear and a hound on guard at her home, for which to ward the love-struck Viking away. But Ragnar could not be kept away, and he would go on to slay the bear with a spear through the heart, and strangle the hound with his bare hands. Lagertha had no choice but to concede, and accepted his offer of marriage. She would have 3 children with Ragnar, their son Friedleif, and 2 daughters who remain unnamed. But Ragnar would not remain content with his wife. In fact, he became pretty bitter that Lagertha had set a bear and hound upon him in the first place. So he packed his bags, and so begins another version of the aforementioned Thora and the serpent story, where Ragnar slays a serpent that had been terrorizing the town, in this case 2 serpents, and he proceeds to marry the daughter of the Jarl as his reward. We actually see Ragnar marry another woman named Swanloga, with whom gives birth to sons Ragnald, Risturk and Eric. Swanloga soon succumbs to disease, however, and dies, and Ragnar is seen to wreak havoc on England, killing King Haem, father of Aila of Northumbria. Aila, who becomes king, seeks out Ragnar and eventually captures him, leading us back to the snake pit where Ragnar meets his demise. The Gesta Danorum also sees the introduction of the son Uber, as a result of Ragnar tricking a peasant woman into sleeping with him. Interestingly, Uber actually revolts against Ragnar and the Vikings, after being prompted by his grandfather, who was the father of the tricked peasant girl, though he is eventually defeated. As far as actual historical events go, many look to the siege of Paris in the year 845 as evidence of Ragnar's existence. The Vikings had invaded the kingdom of West Franks, and were led by a chieftain named Ragnar, or sometimes simply referred to as Ragnar. While it is impossible to link this Ragnar to those legends, there are those that see this Ragnar as one in the same. Historians of course disagree, given the lack of evidence to prove anything in the sagas and the lack of any real links between the two figures. At the same time, Ragnar is also identified with the Viking chief, who was awarded land in France by King Charles the Bald in 841, as a means to get the Vikings to stop pillaging everything. Other sources cite Charles the Bald as having paid 7,000 livres to get the Vikings to go away. Funnily enough, the Viking in question here was also said to have been named Ragnar, but would also lose the favour of King Charles the Bald, causing the Vikings to sail up the Seine River in 845 towards the Abbey of St. Denis, with destruction in mind. Charles the Bald assembled an army to stop him from reaching his destination, and set up two forces on either side of the river. Ragnar was able to defeat one of the divisions, however, and took a total of 111 men as prisoners before hanging them on an island on the side of the Seine River, as a means to terrify the French and honour the Norse god Odin. This Ragnar would later return to Denmark, where he is noted as having died due to a terrible plague that spread throughout the land. While many of Ragnar's exploits have been fabricated, the relationships with his children are less likely to be that of myth, and more rooted in history than you might think. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Bjorn Ironside all appear to be genuinely recognised figures in history, some of which even claimed lineage to the legendary Ragnar. Incidentally, many of their exploits seem to have taken place within accordance of those in the sagas. For example, the great heathen army that invaded Britain, as told in the Icelandic saga, The Tale of Ragnar's Sons. But in any case, it is difficult to definitively determine the fatherhood of the so-called sons of Ragnar. What isn't hard to determine though, is the lasting effects that the supposed sons of Ragnar would come to have on the 9th century England. In the year 865, supposedly under the influence of revenge for their father's death, according to the saga, the great heathen army, led by Ivar the Boneless, landed in East Anglia, where he and his brothers would defeat their forces and capture the king who would become known as Edmund the Martyr. Edmund was given the choice to renounce his faith and rule as a client king for the Vikings, or to be executed. Edmund chose the latter, refusing to give up his faith, and as a result was tied to a tree and filled with arrows before finally being beheaded. The great heathen army would then move on to the city of York, where they would defeat King Alasug and complete their revenge. According to the sagas, they would do this by executing the king after horrendous torture. According to the annals of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the 9th century, however, the death of King Alasug is noted as having taken place on the battlefield at the hands of the Vikings, but his subsequent torture is not mentioned, leading many to believe that the sons of Ragnar did not inflict the gruesome blood eagle or any other form of torture upon the king before his death. As far as we can tell, there was no one single Ragnar Lothbrook. It is much more likely that throughout the bloody days of the 9th century that saw raids, conquest and wars, that the exploits of certain Vikings became unified under one man. Many historians agree that Ragnar Lothbrook is indeed an amalgamation of several other important figures with fearsome exploits, including the Danish king Horik I, who was known for his raids on France. There is also the Viking chief Ragnar, who led the siege on Paris in the year 845, or the entity known as Ragnar, who appeared in the Irish annals as a notorious Viking who raided and settled in Dublin in the early 10th century. In reality, it is likely that the legend of Ragnar Lothbrook would absorb the accolades and achievements of other Vikings in similar positions, particularly those with similar sounding names, and possibly even other Viking chiefs who were committing to the same raids. As a result of this, the actual exploits of Ragnar Lothbrook become blurred with others, and it became increasingly easier for him to slip out of the realm of history and into the realm of mythology. But let me know your thoughts on Ragnar Lothbrook in the comments below. And as always, if you've enjoyed today's video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Until the next time, guys.